unfortunately, we complicate our lives so much, and
We do.
a lot of our negative propensities are always being triggered in our society. And so if we don't have something to counter that or to balance that with a lot of positivity in your life.
Welcome, Gustavo. Thank you for being here with us. How are you?
Thank you. I'm good. I'm great, Diana. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much. I guess we could start just because Tantra is such a, like a wide topic and there are so many paths and interpretations. I think the first question we can start with is what is Tantra to you? Or what's the way you see Tantra and the way you're working with it?
Tantra is a spiritual tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years. It's debatable, its origins. A lot of academics trace Tantra back just around 2000 years, but Tantra was really born at a time where there was no written language, there was no historical records being kept, and it was largely an oral tradition, much like indigenous traditions around the world that also go back thousands of years. So it's an ancient spiritual science that comes from the indigenous people of India. And the goal of Tantra is to become one with the supreme consciousness, become one with Brahma. And that is accomplished through meditation, that is accomplished through a sense of devotion and having a relationship with this supreme consciousness. And it's largely based on meditation and also taking your desire for perfection, for enlightenment, and not just keeping it within yourself, but also bringing that out into the world. So much like indigenous traditions have a scope for seeing the plants as one and the minerals as one and the animals as your siblings. In the same way, Tantra externalizes this spiritual edification and externalizes it so that you try to make the world a better place. You try to see everything as one, since in the end, the goal of Tantra is to be one with not just Brahma, but Brahma in all of its expressions and in all of its forms.
What are the core concepts? Maybe you just mentioned Brahma, for example. Maybe for somebody who has never heard of these things, what are the key concepts to keep in mind that maybe you might be mentioning in the interview later?
Brahma. What is Brahma? Brahma is the Sanskrit word for supreme consciousness. And Brahma is made up of two principles, consciousness and energy, or in Sanskrit, Purusha and Prakriti. So that means that Brahma is observing everything in the universe and Brahma is doing everything in the universe. Much like us, we have the capacity to do things, but we're always observing ourselves doing things. So we're a reflection of Brahma. So we also are a composite of consciousness and energy at any given moment. Well, meditation. So it's based on mantra meditation, and the mantra itself is it's like a password that you have. Every time you repeat it, you ideate on it. So you don't repeat it like a parrot. You have to think about what it means every time you say it. You have to visualize what it means every time you say it. And usually your mantra means something like, I am consciousness, or all is consciousness, or I am that supreme consciousness. And the Sanskrit word that is your mantra, you keep secret. It's passed down from a teacher to a student, and that should be kept private just for you. So I would say those are important points. And then, of course, there's a whole philosophy in Tantra that has to do with chakras, has to do with layers of the mind, chambers of the mind, has to do with nadis and breathing techniques and concentration techniques, and also a moral code. The moral code is yama and niyama, which is the code of ethics in yoga. So it's very vast. That involves spirituality, meditation, spiritual community, a sense of values that you live by. If you don't have that to balance, I know, my life would be completely out of control, So it's it's an enormous thing for myself personally. And also it gives me an opportunity to touch people's lives, to help people, to be of service. Because if I wouldn't be doing so much spiritual work, maybe I would have done more music, which I was already doing in the past. So pop music, rock music, salsa music, and maybe that could have made some kind of impact, maybe. But I think a better impact is what I'm doing now, because I think that meditation is something that can transform people from within,
And how about relationships? How has it
Yeah,
impacted your relationships and the way you communicate and talk to other people and relate to them?
that's where it hasn't done everything. I still have arguments with my mom. That never goes away because
It's like it won't.
what?
It won't. It's part of life.
Right. Especially when you have a mom that doesn't approve of what you do, like in terms of your spiritual life. I was brought up Christian, so my mom would prefer that I was Christian, et cetera, et cetera. So there's tensions in our life that, one day hopefully will get resolved. And a lot of times those tensions are in our relationships. So it doesn't necessarily cure all, right? But when you follow tantric principles, it means that in your relationship, you see the other person as Brahma, as the divine. So as much as possible, you try to remember that this person you're speaking with is Brahma, is an expression of the divine. So you treat them as such. So imagine how that influences you in the way you treat your children. When I see my child, when I see my son, I'm not just taking care of a little boy. I'm taking care of the supreme consciousness in the form of a little boy. When I'm talking to my partner in the same way, you see your partner as an expression of the supreme. So on your best days, when you remember these things, it makes a huge difference. And then following the yamas and niyamas, I think that every couple should become familiar with these principles and practice them in the family, practice them in your relationship. You don't deprive your partner of affection. You don't deprive your partner of understanding. And then there is brahmacharya, which means to see everything as an expression of the divine. So we talked about that earlier, seeing your partner as an expression of the divine. And aparigraha means to live simply. So if you live simply too, you're not so concerned with material accumulation. And that could also help you not treat your partner, as an object. I think our society makes us feel like people are just as expendable as objects, as material things, but we should have more care, right? When we're dealing with human beings, we should have more care with the expressions of consciousness that are more developed, so that includes human beings, that includes animals. So if you want a purely tantric perspective, those are some ideas. But I think aside from Tantra, you need to be very well educated in how to develop relationships, because I think one of the things that we all want to have good relationships. But one of the things that we least invest in as a people is in education on relationships. So that needs to change. People should be reading those books to help people have better relationships, going to seminars, going with your partners to educational events. We go on dates to see movies and to have dinner, but go on a date to hear a chat about, how to improve your relationship, because what you really want is you want that relationship to succeed, right? So I think that's very, very important there. There's also other principles that I can talk about. My guru is named Sri Sri Anandamurti, and he put together these 15 qualities of how to really bring a lot of love into your life, improve your relationships. If you follow these practices, people, they respect you. They see you as somebody who is like a dear sort of... Sorry?
Caring,
Yeah.
maybe.
Right. And so just some of those basic principles are like forgiveness. If you make a mistake, acknowledge that you made a mistake and ask what you can do to make up for it. Don't criticize, don't practice. That's super important, in relationships, is not to overly criticize your partner and to not overly criticize anybody. Those are just a few, that come from the realm of Tantra.
I think that is very important. And I like to highlight that idea of how many things that we see in today's media and society makes us feel that people are like they're at a disposition more than just other human beings with feelings and a lot of other things. And I think personally, I've seen that happen a lot. And for some reason, we also think that we have sex and relationships just figured out, that we don't need to learn about it, that we just know what to do. And we actually usually don't, precisely because of that, because there is also this lack of education, not only sex education, which has to do with relationships, but also education about how to have relationships. Because in sex is not only the physical act of, intercourse. Sex is a lot more. Sex is the way I communicate with my partner. And that's part of my relationship. And it's part of a relationship with a partner as much as it can be part of a relationship with a friend or anybody else. And I think just this idea, and that's something that I learned, I would say pretty recently, that I found out that we have this view of people in terms of our needs. So it's like I have this person in front of me, but instead of seeing the person that I have in front of me, I rush to see first, how are they going to fulfill needs that I have? And then sometimes we forget, or we don't see that behind the act of maybe fulfilling any need that you have for somebody, maybe you need someone to listen to you, maybe you need affection, maybe you need, physical touch, whatever it is. This person has to make an effort to give you that, because it's coming from another human being who is deciding to give you this as a gift. So it's not really something that you can just go and say, yeah, that's there. And like, I don't have to worry or think about it. So I think it's very important what you just mentioned, because thinking of these things as things we need to educate ourselves all the time about and become better at, because despite what they make us believe, we don't have it figured out. And the way we see portrayed usually in the media, and that, and even the way that our parents sometimes teach us that relationships work, maybe they're not the best ways. They are certainly not the only ways. And maybe they're not the way for us, the one that's going to make us feel good. How would you say that Tantra and sex intersect?
I would say that there's 3 types of sex. There's physical sex, mental sex, and spiritual sex. Physical sex is when you have sexual intercourse with somebody, right? You're engaged in sexual activity with another person physically. Mental sex is when you imagine that you are having sex with another person. So it's all happening in the mind. And as you know, if it happens in the mind, there's a reaction in the body.
Of course.
And then there is spiritual sex. Spiritual sex is now a psycho-spiritual activity. So it's now the idea of, because when you're having physical sex and mental sex, you are connecting with another person, right? But when you're having spiritual sex, now you are connecting with the divine, with the supreme consciousness. So you, just like you want to connect with another person and be one, we have also a desire to want to connect with supreme entity and also be one with them. So I think that spiritual sex, like any type of sex, is really just the desire to be allowed into somebody else's world, right? It's desire to be embraced by another person. And that place of vulnerability is actually the most intimate thing that we can have happen to us. So it's a craving that we have. It's something we all long to experience. And that same idea gets applied now to your relationship with the divine, that you also want to enter the divine, be embraced by the divine, be one with the divine. And so that's to me what spiritual sex is. And that's to me how Tantra intersects. Now, you could also be having physical sex with somebody and apply tantric principles where you're making love with your partner, but you feel in that moment that you're actually making love with the supreme consciousness. So when you kiss them, you feel like you're kissing the supreme consciousness. When you're holding them, you feel like you're holding the supreme consciousness. That type of ideation can really make your sexual experience or any activity tantric, because another word for tantric is just spiritual. And sometimes people, they need someone to help them process, right? So they may not even know how to articulate. You may be asking your partner, what's wrong? Well, why isn't this working? Why? But it's quite possible that your partner can't even articulate why they feel the way they do. And so there's something there that they still have to process. And so if you become aware of that, then you have to encourage that first to gain clarity, because the person has to have clarity within themselves first before they can be clear with you. And then there's so many things we're socialized around sex, right? Like so many people say, oh, the more sex you have, the better the relationship. If you're not having sex, you're lame, you have a bad relationship. And these are all just like
it's just society.
Yeah, exactly. It's the chatter, right? It's the chatter going on that doesn't necessarily you don't have to believe that. You don't have to get It's like the many thoughts in your mind. You have countless thoughts in your mind. Doesn't mean you have to believe them, all of them, because there's
That would
so
be
many.
crazy.
Exactly. So many ridiculous thoughts that come into the mind all the time. Imagine if you believed each one of them.